Another function we need to build is the ability to find a row of data based on a player ID and season ID. To find this row of data, we need to loop over a data frame, then check to see if the season ID and player ID both match our function's input. Recall our preferred method for looping over data frames? We want to use the iterTuples method. In our example, we did the following for a Laker DF. So if I reuse this data, I'm going to create a Laker data frame. And what we did before is we said for row in Laker DF iterTuples, print the first name, which we access with the row dot notation, and print the row last name, and print the row points per game, which are basically first name, last name, and just points per game. And if we run this, you'll see we get the first name, last name, and points per game for each row in our data frame. Even though we just printed the row.firstName and row.lastName, we were able to access with the dot notation. So let's do the same, but loop over a new master data frame and print the row season ID and row player ID. To save us some space, let's just take 10 random rows from our data frame. So we are going to again read in our master data frame, but this time let's just save it as data frame. So this is our per game stats that we'll be using in our model. And to make it easy, we're going to take a sample 10 rows, and we are going to just save this to an example data frame. And then like before, for row in df example iterTuples, print the row season ID and the row player ID. So here we have the season ID and the player ID. We know we want to return a row in our function if the two conditions are met. So if we had an X and a Y condition, then really what we're after is something like if X equals row.seasonID and Y equals row.player ID, return the entire row so we can access the other data points. Now let's drop this into a findPlayer function and change the X and Y to player ID season. So we will create a findPlayer function that takes the player ID and the player season. And then we're again looking for row in df example iterTuples if the player season equals the row.seasonID and the player ID equals the row.player ID, then return the row. So that's defined. And again, let's just look at our df example to know what we're dealing with. Okay. And let's test it with the player ID and a season ID that we know are in our df example data frame. So let's take this one and that one. So we'll have our findPlayer function that takes the player ID, which is 201. We'll copy it. That's an integer. And we want the season ID, which recall is actually a string method. And let's run this. And you'll see we get all of the row data. And let's make sure it works if we use a season ID that's not in the data frame, so it doesn't meet the condition. And let's check for the 2021 and 22 season, and it doesn't return anything. Cool. One last thing we want to do is add in another input to this, which is the data frame. Then what we can do is reference the data frame within the function. This will help us in case we are passing different data frames in our model. So if we come back here, and now we write it as a data frame as another input, then all of a sudden we can change our df example to df iter tuples, and it should work the same. And to make sure it is, let's test it out and see if it's working properly to get LeBron James 2012-2013 MVP season. And I've referenced this before, but if we look at our master data frame and the D types, the player ID is an integer and the season ID is an object, which means we can pass it as the float. We can pass it as the string. And again, we know LeBron, the player ID and the player season. That player ID is actually 2544. And the season we are going to look at is his 2012-2013 Miami Heat MVP season. And we are going to find player, passing in our master data frame, passing in that player and passing in that season. And there you have it. We have LeBron James, age 28. Wow, look at those stats. That was when he almost shot nearly 60% from the field for a while. Great, on to the next.